Yeah, that's great. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, spending the evening with us. My name is Post-Castro Era. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. And we have a number of the staff of the center here. If you want to ask questions about what we do, please do. We have a number of events coming up. We have a retirement party for a lady who has been working at AU for over 30 years from El Salvador. We're celebrating here at 11 a.m. tomorrow at Spring Valley Building, the 6th floor. And then we have two events 2 weeks from now on Mexico and the Mexican elections by members of the opposition. And also we have some visitors from El Salvador, from a university. They're coming and having events with us all of next week. So let us know if you want more information about that. And if you are not receiving the emails from the center, please also talk to us after the event so we can add it to our mailing list, because we always have events happening. All right, one more housekeeping thing, and then we'll get to the matter. Welcome all of you who are joining us on Zoom. Please mute your microphones. You are welcome. We're going to be recording, so you probably got the alert, but if you don't want to show your face, turn off your camera. But you're also welcome to keep it on if you prefer. And we will be taking your questions. Please type them down, and then Karina Siona, our program coordinator, will be monitoring the chat. And they can be asking the questions at the end that you guys have over Zoom. Excellent. So without further ado, we're here to celebrate the third edition, basically a new book, Contemporary Cuba, the Post-Castro Era. Many of us cannot believe we're talking about that, but yeah, Castro came and went, and now it's history that these guys are writing about. And a lot of new things to talk about this book. It's on sale on the back. You can please get a copy. It's terrific work by a lot of experts on the area, the company here included, but also a lot of authors based in Cuba who wrote in Spanish and got it translated. So it's also Cuban knowledge that we're having here. All the royalty earnings that the authors get are going to be donated to the Martin Luther King Center in Havana. So you also contributed to that cause. And let me introduce the four co-editors. We're very happy they're all four. The four of them are here with us today. I'm going to let them speak for between 5 and 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So the first is our own LeoGrande, who is a professor of government and a specialist in Latin American politics and U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America. He's a professor who has been a frequent advisor to government and private sector agencies. He has written 5 books, including our own backyard, the United States in Central America, from 1977 to 1992. Most recently, he is the co-author of Back Channel to Cuba, the hidden history of negotiations between Washington and Havana. And he's one of the actors in that story. Previously, he served on the staffs of the Democratic Party Committee of the United States Senate and the Democratic Caucus Task Force on Central America of the United States House of Representatives. Professor LeoGrande has been Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow and a Pew Faculty Fellow in International Affairs. His articles have appeared in various international and national journals, magazines, and newspapers, who often quote him on issues dealing with Cuba and Latin America. Then to my further right, we have Philip Brenner, who is a professor of international relations and an affiliate professor of history at American University. He has served as a Senior Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and Director of the U.S. Foreign Policy Program in the School of International Service, and as a co-director of the American University Interdisciplinary Council on Latin America. His more recent book is A Contemporary Cuba Reader from Roman and Littlefield. He is also the author of Sad and Luminous Days, Cuba's Struggle with the Superpowers After the Missile Crisis, and the author of numerous articles in academic journals, magazines, and newspapers. A specialist on U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America, Dr. Brenner is a member of the advisory board of the National Security Archive and the Center for Democracy in the Americas. He received his PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University and his BA in history from Columbia University. To my left, we have Bastian, who is an assistant professor at Wheaton College in Massachusetts, and is the author of Everyday Adjustments in Havana, Economic Reforms, Mobility, and Emerging Inequalities, published in 2018, which examines the impacts of economic reforms on everyday life and inequalities in socialist Cuba. From 2015 to 2021, she taught at the University of Havana and worked in the consortium for advanced studies abroad at the Casa de las Americas in Havana. Her field research explores the impacts of economic reforms on everyday life and inequalities and social movements around birth, breastfeeding, LGBTQ+ rights, and gender violence in Cuba's emerging virtual public sphere. And she's also an alumna of the PhD in anthropology at American University. So welcome back. And then, last but not least, we have Professor John M. Kirk, who is a professor of Latin American Studies at Dalhousie University in Canada since 1978. He's the author and co-editor of 17 books on Cuba. The most recent are Cuba, the Crossroads, Cuban Foreign Policy, Transformation under Raul Castro, and Healthcare Without Borders, Understanding Cuban Medical Internationalism. He is the editor of a book series with Lexington Press in the United States and has published 40 articles in Cuba in academic journals in the US, the UK, Mexico, El Salvador, and Cuba. So please, let's give them a warm welcome and an applause. So we'll start with Phil, who's going to tell us a little bit more about some of the strengths of this volume.
Thank you very much. It's working. Thank you very much, Ernesto, and thanks to the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies for sponsoring this event. Before I begin, I would like to note that while the four of us each have articles in this volume, this wouldn't be a special book without the more than 20 authors who are also in this book who wrote original articles for it. So we're just a small part of that, but sadly, one of those authors, Armando Nova, died just after he finished writing the article. Sad about that. He's sorely missed. I'm going to start this session by talking about the Cuban economy. So there's no question that Cuba's economy is not functioning well. It doesn't provide the standard of living that Cubans want or expect. Consider that economic growth in Cuba has increased by 1 or 2% in the last few years, and before that, it was actually in decline. The country has experienced widespread blackouts, oil shortages have made transportation difficult, medicines are in short supply, and there are shortages of basic foodstuffs. Cuba still imports 70% of its food despite an abundance of land for agriculture. These imports require Cuba to use scarce, hard currency that could be better spent on internal development. Meanwhile, it's not increased its ability to earn hard currency. Cuba might be able to produce electricity with alternative fuels, such as biomass, as sugar on the island, but its sugar production has been in such steady decline that it doesn't have enough biomass to feed the one biomass power generating plant that it actually has. One might be tempted to call this a crisis, but a crisis is an unexpected set of events, and this is not so unexpected. Cuba's leaders of many years recognized that there are deep-seated economic problems in Cuba. In 2010, Raul Castro called for a major overhaul of the Cuban economy. In the next year, the National Assembly and the Party Congress approved a major set of reforms called the Guidelines for Economic and Social Policies of the Party of the Revolution. These are known as the lineamientos. But since then, as Ricardo Torres writes in his chapter in the book, economic reform remains a work in progress at best. Indeed, there have been several reforms which the Cuban government describes updating the Cuban model. For example, the 2019 Constitution recognizes that the non-state sector has an important role to play in the economy. It proclaims the goal of decentralizing economic decisions at the provincial level, which could enable experimentation. The government has instituted a system for medium and small enterprises to be established as legal entities. Wholesale markets have been established so that restaurants now don't compete with ordinary Cubans. So the price of food isn't driven up. The dual currency was eliminated in order to facilitate exchange with foreign entities. But The reforms have been implemented slowly, and at times some initiatives have even been reversed, and some changes have made life even worse for ordinary Cubans. For example, the elimination of the formal dual currency system has been replaced by an informal dual currency system in which the US dollar circulates along with the Cuban peso, which continues to lose value. There are two immediate and two long-term factors that lie at the heart of Cuba's economic dilemma. The immediate factors are the pandemic, which hurt most economies in Latin America, and US policy. As a result of the pandemic, Cuba shut its doors to tourism, which had become its major source of hard currency. While tourism is beginning to rebound, it's still at only half the level that it was in 2019. US policy, which we might call the Trump-Biden policy, as Bill LeoGrande will explain soon, undermines the Cuban economy in several ways. Travel restrictions make it difficult for US citizens to visit Cuba. For institutions such as the Smithsonian to sponsor travel, and for cruise ships to dock in Cuban ports. The US designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism makes international banking transactions expensive or impossible, as banks and foreign companies fear penalties. The US embargo constrains Americans from supporting small businesses, and most importantly, it denies Cuba the opportunity to sell its advanced medicines and other products in the United States. So those are the short-term factors, but there are two longer-term, more systemic factors. Not all officials in the Cuban government are committed to change, to restructuring the economy. There are some who reasonably fear that increased privatization will lead to even greater inequality than Cuba is already experiencing. And in effect, the very meaning of the Cuban Revolution would be vitiated. There are some opposed decentralization because they don't want to lose their status or power, and they even believe that provincial officials are incompetent. Some oppose reforms because they are actually corrupt and enjoy the privileges they've been able to amass for themselves in the midst of scarcity. So that's one problem. There are people who resist change. The second problem is the lack of foreign investment, and which Cuba needs in order to be able to restructure itself. And in order to build its infrastructure and renovate its productive capacity. It's unlikely to be forthcoming for several reasons. Cuba already has significant outstanding loans that it's having trouble repaying. It makes it an unlikely candidate to get more loans. Numerous regulations still make Cuba an impossible venue for private investment. And Cuba's major trading partners, especially China, don't have the ability at the moment to provide significant new investment, even if they were inclined to do so. Several articles in the book suggest ways that Cuba might be able to overcome both the short and long-term obstacles in order to achieve development with equity. But for the proposals to work, there would need to be a countrywide commitment driven by an almost blind faith in Cuba's political leaders and their vision for the future. Paris writes in an introductory essay, a very poignant piece about it, where Paris, who is in many ways the dean of historians, and who's always had a very positive outlook, writes that the kind of thing that I'm talking about seems to disappear. Appeals to historic figures who champion the national project of sovereignty and independence do not animate Cubans as they once did. That is the greatest economic problem facing Cuba today. Thanks. Bill?
Thank you, Bill. So with an economic situation like Professor Brenner just described, you can imagine that political discontent is on the rise in Cuba. Governments always get blamed for economic problems, and socialist governments in particular, since they, in fact, are managing these problems. This government today in Cuba really faces a serious problem of legitimacy. The historic generation, the ones that founded the regime and had a certain degree of prestige and legitimacy for being the founders, has really mostly passed from the scene. Fidel Castro, of course, stepped down in 2006 as a result of illness. Raul Castro took over and led the government until 2018, led the Communist Party until 2041. But now a new generation of leaders is in place, born after the revolution, and they have to demonstrate their legitimacy by performance. And for Cubans, performance, the most important performance, is really economic performance because of the hardship that they've been through since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so far, the government has failed to do that. There is not only growing discontent over the economic crisis, but this is happening at a moment when Cubans have become connected. Cuba has undergone a very rapid digitization, with now something like 80% of the population having access to the internet, most of them via mobile phones. And if you put those two things together, you find that social media has given Cubans the opportunity to create virtual social networks outside control of the government. And even before the pandemic, those social networks began to manifest themselves in the real world around important policy issues that people had in common. So there were the private entrepreneurs, as they become more important in the economy, have begun to come together and make demands of the government around the regulatory scheme and the taxation scheme that they live under. The LGBTQ community organized itself to defend its rights when they were challenged by the Cuban Catholic and evangelical Protestant churches. Animal rights defenders organized a movement to get a law that would protect animals, a law against animal cruelty. The artists organized themselves, demanding an end to censorship and harassment. And taxi drivers, private taxi drivers, actually went on strike when Phil and I were in Cuba 3-4 years ago, just before the pandemic. Now, the government's response initially to these kinds of what I would call emergent social or emergent special interest groups was actually quite conciliatory, because the demands that they were making didn't really challenge the fundamental principles of the system. They weren't challenging socialism. Well, the artists were at the margin there, I will say. But by and large, their demands could be accommodated, at least to some extent, without basically reorganizing the way the government and the economy work. But then came July 11th, 2021. What began as a small dissident demonstration of really just a few dozen people on a Sunday in front of a church was able to recruit religious believers coming out of church. It grew to 100, 200 people. And then they began marching through this suburb of the city of Havana, calling for people to join them in the protest, saying, the people are in the streets, join us, join us. And they marched around for a couple of hours, this community. And by the end, they had 3,000 or 4,000 people marching. All of them streaming live on their cell phones, this demonstration, all over the island. And it touched off similar demonstrations in over 100 towns and cities, including very big ones in the city of Havana and a city outside of Santiago. So as you can imagine, that scared the hell out of the government. And it began to really crack down on the opposition. A few months after that spontaneous demonstration, which I will say didn't have a clear ideological program or political program. It was people angry about the economic deprivation that they were facing, people angry about the electricity blackouts, people angry about the shortages of food, people just generally angry and feeling that the government wasn't doing its job. But the opposition, the organized opposition, saw an opportunity. And so they tried to organize nationwide demonstrations with a political program of political change in November of that same year. And it failed completely. Now, partly it failed because the police harassed the organizers and made it clear that they regarded this demonstration as counter-revolutionary, which of course was a deterrent for anyone who participated. But it was partly also because this was organized by intellectuals, artists primarily, on a Facebook group with a political program that didn't speak to the economic hardships that people were facing, which is to say that their message didn't appeal to most ordinary people. And I think then the third reason that it failed is that it was a Facebook group without any actual organizational capacity in the streets. So it was the equivalent of what the 26th of July movement did in April of 1958, of calling for a general strike without actually organizing a general strike, and it didn't work. But the government has followed up on that by really closing down political space. The government recognizes very well the kind of latent political discontent that exists on the island, and it is closing off any opportunity for organized opponents to mobilize that latent discontent, because it saw on July 21, or July 11 rather, in 2021, just how rapidly that discontent could be mobilized. There have continued to be localized outbursts of demonstrations, angry demonstrations about, again, mostly around electricity blackouts, which are very tough for people. So you have this peculiar combination in Cuba right now of enormous latent discontent, but no effective organized opposition available to channel. And so if we put it in terms of development economist Albert Hirschman, there is declining loyalty to the government. There is very little opposition opportunity to express voice. And so people are exercising their right to exit. And that's where we see the migration crisis that Cuba is facing today. Last year, over 400,000 Cubans left the island. That's more than, to come to the United States, not counting people who went elsewhere, more than both the crisis of the Mariel boat lift under Jimmy Carter and the 1994 Rafters crisis under Bill Clinton combined. This year, it will be close to 200,000 more Cubans. Most of the people leaving are young, educated people, and it's a terrible loss of human capital for the Cuban economy and for the Cuban nation. So to finish up, the government really faces a tough dilemma right now. To take the steps necessary to put the economy in order really requires macroeconomic structural adjustment. And that will inflict even more pain on a population that has experienced extraordinary pain in the years since the pandemic began. And so obviously that entails even greater political risk than the government faces now. And yet not taking the steps to adjust the economy means a continuation of the current economic crisis indefinitely, and the continuing suffering of ordinary people, and a continuing erosion of the government's legitimacy. And there's no easy answer for this. For the Cuban people, what it means, I'm sorry to say, is that things are likely to get worse before they get better. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. John, if you want to go next.
Thank you. Buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Thank you very much for hosting this, Ernesto. I had the responsibility of looking at international relations of Cuba, and there are 7 chapters in the book, and there is light at the end of the tunnel in the sense that Cuba's foreign policy is extremely well developed, well managed. I wanted to refer briefly to relations that Cuba has with Russia, with China, and with Mexico, and then conclude with some general observations. Cuba is a small country. Most people don't realize it's about the size in population of Georgia. In terms of surface area, it's about the size of Virginia. It's a very small country. It's based 90 miles away from the United States. It's had a revolutionary government for 6 decades, and it's a unique case of survival, given the opposition which has come from the United States for those 6 decades. The case of Russia is very interesting because Russia is desperate for support internationally after the invasion of Ukraine. The adage that the enemy of my enemy is my ally is very, very true. And so as a result, Russia and Cuba have shared interests. As Bill writes in one of his chapters, realpolitik dictates that Cuba cultivates good relations with Russia and China as long as it lives in the shadow of a hostile United States. That's exactly what has happened. Russia is isolated, badly needs support, and has looked to Cuba. But Russia is also looking at investing in Cuba in a way which ties in with what Phil was talking about earlier, the need for investment. And there have been very special concessions made to Russian entrepreneurs, which are worth noting. Land concessions of 30 years, whereas 20 years for Cubans, tax incentives, a special regime in hiring Cuban workers, repatriating profits, Russian banks possibly to be established, exemptions from import taxes. So Russia is increasingly investing in and trading with Cuba. Last week, Russian business czar Boris Titov was in Havana again for meetings with the Cuban president. And if you look at the number of Russian leaders who've been in recent years, or this year, in recent months, Foreign Minister Lavrov, the president of the State Duma or Parliament, the economic advisor of the presidency, Oreshkin, the deputy prime minister, Cheryshenko, the CEO of the state oil company, Rosneft. So you can see that for Cuba, this is offers the potential of increased investment. There are clear benefits too in terms of aid, material aid from Russia, in terms of food, in terms of fuel, in terms of medicines. After the Matanzas oil fire last year, Russia was one of the first countries to provide support. Russia is also providing infrastructure support in terms of imports, steels, and sugar. Russian tourism has increased. During the COVID years, Russian tourists were the single largest group, displacing my compatriots, the Canadians. Canadians are now back in the game, and we represent 40%. Trade has increased as well. Trade between Cuba and Russia is not that great, but the trade figures up to August are 3 times what they were in 2021. Relationship with Beijing is different. It is basically geostrategic importance for China. Given Cuba's extraordinary relationship with the global South, it behoves China to have very good relations, and that is the case. Cuba is a member of the Belt and Road Initiative since 2021, and there are Chinese investments in technology, renewable energy, biotechnology, telecommunications, and infrastructure. So China is becoming increasingly important. President Diaz-Canel visited China in November 2022, and more recently at the BRICS meeting in South Africa this summer, President Xi made a very strong statement supporting Cuban sovereignty and opposing the embargo. Look at Mexico. Mexico under López Obrador has had an extremely important role in supporting Cuba. He's gone out of his way to support Cuba. This week, he said in a press conference that Mexico would help Cuba in any way we can. For Mexico, support for Cuba illustrates AMLO's nationalist program, and in particular, standing up to U.S. policy. He did so this week in Palenque, talking about U.S. migration. In 2021, Cuba was the invited guest of honor for the Mexico's 200th independence celebrations. President Diaz-Canel has been to Mexico 4 times, so Cuba recognizes the enormous significance. Cuba's benefited in material things as well. After the Matanzas oil refinery, Russia, Mexico, and Venezuela provided the largest support. The following month in September, Hurricane Ian, again, Mexico, plane loads of assistance came from Mexico. Mexican oil this year has surpassed oil from Russia. So Pemex has become very involved donating oil and also selling oil to Cuba. Abdallah vaccines, 5.3 million vaccines have been sold to Mexico this year. And on national television at a press conference this week, President López Obrador, to show how much he trusted that Abdallah, the Cuban vaccine, was vaccinated on national television. A bit of showmanship, but also to show support. Medical internationalism is so very important. In Cuba, in Mexico at the moment, there are 806 Cuban doctors in 16 states providing medical support in underserved areas. There are also 430 Mexican doctors who are training in Cuba. And the Morena candidates have all said that they will continue this initiative if they win the election. López Obrador is meeting with President Biden mid-November and said that he will bring up the Cuba issue and will push for a more sensible policy on the United States to Cuba. Some general thoughts on the big picture of Cuban foreign policy. International medical support, medical internationalism. Most people don't realize exactly what Cuba has done. During COVID, for instance, Cuba provided 5,000 doctors, nurses, and technicians to provide support in 40 countries. If you go back to the origins of Cuban Medical International since 1960, 605,000 doctors, nurses, and technicians have worked in 165 nations. It is extraordinary. I think it puts the developed world to shame to see what the Cubans have managed to do. And at present, according to figures I got last week, there are 23,069 medics working in 55 countries, almost entirely in the global south, although increasingly in Italy and Portugal. You can imagine the positive impression that having access to medical care has for someone who hadn't had it before. And so this brings both international prestige to Cuba as well as hard currencies. Some numbers. Cuba has got 184 embassies and 34 consulates abroad. So the diplomatic relations which Cuba projects abroad are quite extraordinary. In Havana, there are 116 embassies, which is quite extraordinary if you can consider that Mexico City, Mexico, of course, is approximately 11 times bigger than Cuba, but Mexico City, there are 86 embassies. So Cuba has got more. So you see the international significance of Cuba. Most recently, Cuba was elected head of the Group of 77 plus China. In other words, Cuba was, for the last year, has been leading and as the elected leader of 134 nations. In September, at the summit of the G77, 31 heads of state, 12 vice presidents, and Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, participated in Havana. So you can see the prestige that Cuba has as a result of its international policy to get 31 heads of state and 12 vice presidents there. Cuba was also elected just a few weeks ago to the UN Human Rights Council with the support of 146 countries. It led the group for Latin America and the Caribbean. This is the 6th time that Cuba has been elected. Cuba is also on the executive now, or has just finished being on the executive of the UN Economic and Social Council, the International Labour Organization, the Pan American Health Organization, UNICEF, World Food Programme. Final number to your consideration, 185, 2 and 2. Last November at the UN General Assembly, 185 nations condemned the US embargo. 2, the United States and Israel supported the embargo. 2, help me here. No. 2 abstained. Brazil and also now. And no, both. You can find out the other country that. Yeah.
Small Pacific Island. One of them.
No, it wasn't Palau. It wasn't. No.
No, but there's other small Pacific Islands that are catered to.
Okay. Yes. November the 1st and 2nd, next week, there will be the next vote It'll be the 31st time that the US policy has been condemned. So to summarize, how can we summarize this broad area of foreign relations held by this small country? I suggest considering it from the question of the lens of engagement or isolation. For many people, Cuba is a small, isolated, lonely, historic relic. I would argue that Cuba's foreign policy has shown that that's not the case at all. Cuba has skillfully used a policy of developing relations multilaterally and bilaterally with many countries and international organizations. Cuba has an extremely active and successful foreign policy. It could be argued that despite the current socioeconomic crisis of the island, which Bill and Phil have referred to, a key factor in the survival of the revolutionary process, perhaps the key factor, is the pragmatic, activist, and internationalist foreign policy of Cuba. As the book shows, it has worked very well indeed. Thank you.
Yeah. Hope.
Great. So my name is Hope. That's all I'm going to give you. My name is Hope, and I'm an anthropologist, right? And so I'm going to follow up on these presentations about the economics, about the foreign policy, the political changes in Cuba in this period. So we're talking 2018 to 2022, and the book coming up till today does a remarkable, we had to do a little, fortune telling, right? We finished this book this time last year. And when I reread it today, it still very much captures what's going on in Cuba today, right? And we're describing a period. I think this book, one of the things that this book does so well is to describe this period where even many people who study Cuba, who have been following developments on the island, haven't been able to be in Cuba on the ground during this period, right? Because of the pandemic. And so this combination of authors, academics from outside the island, but also academics living on the island during this period, have really unique perspectives. And so I'm gonna, as an anthropologist, of course, what we like to do is to look at these big macro things, these policies, these big changes that happen very far away from the kitchen table, and to see what are the impacts on people's lives and how our people's everyday lives also kind of both those things affecting the everyday practices, everyday experiences, but also what people do every day, how that also comes up, right? Okay. Yeah. And so kind of the society chapter looks at what these things that my colleagues have talked about, what does this look like on the ground, right? What does this feel like? What are the societal and cultural shifts that have happened during this period from 2018 to 2022? And really looks at the impacts of a lot of different pieces, right? The lineamientos, right, with Raúl Castro. It took a while to know what the impacts of those changes and those policies are, right? We have the Trump-Biden policy. And before that, we have Obama, right? And the changes during that period. The Trump-Biden policy, Díaz-Canel's government, and the changes that have come with that as well, right? And so what are the impacts? And the book shows in the last section, what are the impacts of all of these big things, these big changes on Cubans on the island, right? In the everyday, right? But also Cubans living abroad, which is a group that is rapidly growing, as Bill mentioned. And also, what are the impacts of all of these things on the future of the revolution, right? Both the state and political power, but also the values of the revolution. And so in the society section, we have a series of essays. Let's see. 7 of the 8 authors are women scholars, female scholars. 6 out of the 8 of them lived in Cuba in the period that they're describing, right? So it's really, really rich perspectives. We have an essay about the social racial restratification and the ways in which the inequalities between Afro-Cubans and white Cubans, and looking at income, looking at savings. It was a national survey, remittances, self-employment, the opportunities that are coming in the Cuban economy now, and the structural disadvantages that Afro-Cubans are facing, right? We have a chapter on rural Cuba, right? Even within Cuban academia, so much of the study happens in the capital, right? And this essay is research done in rural Cuba, looking at how gendered vulnerabilities that are rooted in failures of infrastructure to deliver services, transportation, markets, education, and care in rural areas are reinforcing inequalities, not only between the countryside and the city, but also gender relations, and creating an environment where there's increased gender violence, right? There's also a chapter to understand local politics in Cuba. You no longer can do that without looking at the impacts of these new Pentecostal and evangelical churches, right? How in Cuba, in a socialist society, have these very small groups of churches and leaders mounted very successful campaigns to oppose two of the government, Diaz-Canel's government's most important legislative priorities, right? And both the Constitution and the Family Code, right? And that contribution is written by a Cuban pastor and an LGBTQ activist, right? And they're bringing this perspective of what grassroots mobilizations against inequality, what they're having to face today in Cuba, and how this very small group of churches have become major political actors in Cuba, right? And that's something that we have to keep an eye on for the future. Looking towards the future as well, Cuba as an aging country, and how the state and how Cuban academics are planning for that future and trying to put in the infrastructure that needs to be created for people to age in Cuba with dignity and with quality of life. There's a chapter on climate change, Cuba's long-term commitment to protecting lives and livelihoods in the face of climate change, and also on public health, right? Looking both at what happened with COVID in Cuba, what was the state's response, what was the public health system's response, but also how has the public health system been affected both by COVID and all of the other crises that are going on, right? And what impact does that have on everyday life for Cubans, for families, for mother-in-laws, for everyday life, right? But also, what impact will that have on the state in terms of political impacts, legitimacy, and the capacity of the state to give the Cuban people the future that we all hope for them. So that's where we end up.
Thank you.
What you think about your questions, and then we'll see if there's any on Zoom. Let me ask a very simple question. I'm going back to the book per se. Why a third edition? You were telling me before that most of the essays, most of the chapters are brand new texts. So you can just call it a new thing and make it another book of your many publications. So maybe you're competing with yourselves. So tell us why a third edition?
So the first edition came out 17 years ago. And what's remarkable is that that was published that shortly after Fidel Castro took ill, Raul Castro stepped in. We had no idea really what was going to be happening in Cuba, but we had a sense that Cuba was on an upward trajectory. It had recovered from the special period when things were very bad after the Soviet Union collapsed. And it did seem like Raul Castro would be able to seize the possibilities of transforming Cuba. He was a very good manager. And the book had a lot of hope in it. So the book essentially had articles that helped you understand what had happened in the prior 10 or 15 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But it ended with a sense of hope. The second edition, which came out about 7 years after that, was an effort to try to understand what Cuba was like under Raúl Castro. And we thought it was necessary because there were changes going on, changes in the economy, political changes. There was much more openness. Cubans were allowed to travel. And so daily life was very different. And it came out just prior to the opening of the United States, which we didn't know was going to happen, but Phil LeoGrande told us would happen. So there was, again, a sense of hope. You probably detected in the presentations here a very different tone. And we thought it was necessary to have a book that now captured what's going on here. We're much less hopeful. Cubans are much less hopeful. We thought it was important for people to understand how that dynamic is playing out. As John Kirk described, there are certainly possibilities because of Cuba's dynamic international policy. But other aspects require some great change, and we're not as hopeful as we were in the prior editions. That's why we published this.
I would just add really quickly that the reason that we pegged this as a third edition as opposed to just a brand new book, since all the essays are brand new, is because we were following essentially a similar format of the sections and what kinds of topics we wanted to cover. And we've been fortunate to have a following out there in the publishing world of people assigning books for their classes and so on. And the publisher wanted to make sure that we connected with that constituency and didn't lose.
I think one of the things that I would say, I wasn't on the first couple of editions. I'm new. They brought hope on. But I think what's so important about this book is both the following that it has, because it's a great opportunity for faculty who are teaching classes about Cuba to really give students who don't know anything about Cuba so much background information so quickly and so succinctly from people who really, they know so much and they're able to synthesize it in a way that's really accessible. So I think that's why, right? And then the other reason why, of course, is often in the United States, there's this vision of Cuba as not ever changing just because there's old cars, that nothing has changed. And anyone who knows anything about Cuba knows that that could not be further from the truth, right? And so after X number of years, you have to completely rewrite the book because the country is completely different. And I think that's always true. And it's even more true in this time period that we cover in the book. Yeah. So your students cannot buy the last version on the internet and just read that one. No, you have to buy the new book. It's a different new book.
Racking my memory, and the two countries that abstained, I'm furious, were Bolsonaro, Brazil, the Trump of the tropics, as he'd like to be called, and also Ukraine. And the reason for the Ukraine was precisely because after the Chernobyl meltdown, Cuba provided medical assistance at no charge to 25,000 kids who were victims of the meltdowns from Ukraine. So the Ukraine, despite massive amounts of support from the United States, nevertheless abstained. I think it's because, to go back to the original question of Ernesto, I'd like to read something from President Xi in China, and I quote, "No matter how the international situation changes, China's commitment to our long-standing friendship with Cuba will not change. China's determination to support Cuba in pursuing socialism will not change. China's determination to work alongside Cuba to safeguard international equity and justice and to oppose the hegemony of the powerful will not change," quote unquote. So I think that in terms of international relations, China has doubled down, not only because of the geostrategic interests, but also because it sees Cuba as in many ways the leader of the global South and wants to be able to work with them. The change in Russia is interesting as well. The interest in investment and trade increasing I think is very important. So I think that to follow what my colleagues have said, there were sufficient changes that we had to, because Cuba was changing and Cuban international relations were changing. Mexico in particular is perhaps the biggest change. And of course, with the pinkish tide, not the pink tide that was before, but the pinkish tide, and we'll see what happens in Argentina on November the 19th, but there's been significant change in Latin America. The Caribbean is very supportive. CARICOM supports Cuba basically because half its doctors have been trained in Cuba. But Latin America has got the potential to provide a significant increase in assistance to Cuba. So changing dynamics.
Thank you, everyone. Questions from the audience? Rob.
So just continuing from Hope's noting in the John Amplify, how much has changed Cuba since say the last visit. But then thinking about that in the context of the frustratingly persistent geopolitical status quo around the U.S.-Cuba relations, how would you describe the changing, whether there is any sense of appreciation or room for maneuver at this point, given change, but also given where we seem to be geopolitically in that sense? So there's a sense in which it's not that Cuba never changed to the federal card, but here we are back again in the same ridiculous place that we were pre-2014. Why? And given this Trump, etc. Why don't you repeat the question?
Yeah, for the people on Zoom, the question really was about U.S.-Cuban relations, and even as things are changing so dramatically in Cuba, we seem sort of stuck in the same bilateral relationship that we've been in for the last 60 years. And even more broadly, the global geopolitical situation seems very reminiscent of what it was 30, 40 years ago, right? I've taken to calling it Cold War 2.0. So, I think U.S. policy towards Cuba is stuck for a couple of different reasons. One is the obvious one of Florida politics and the importance of the Cuban-American vote, which everybody's familiar with. The other, though, I think is what you've hit on, Rob, and it's the geopolitics. It's the fact that President Biden has defined his foreign policy as the struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. The principal authoritarian adversaries of the United States at this moment are Russia and China. Cuba's two most important international friends and supporters are Russia and China. And Cuba is an authoritarian regime. So Cuba, as it was during the first Cold War, is put in the camp of adversaries, which then makes it really difficult for any U.S. administration to take positive moves toward Cuba when the broader geopolitical conflict is heating up. And I think, that plus the domestic political burden is what has deterred the Biden administration from actually doing anything. And, with the election campaign already underway for 2024, I'll be surprised to see any change, any consequence in U.S.-Cuban relations between now and then.
Just quick follow-up on that, and I'm sorry. One thing that might have changed is the behavior of the rest of Latin America toward the United States, vis-a-vis Cuba, and the additional, insistence that Cuba participate in multilateral forums, etc. Do we see any crack there in the way that the U.S., for its own standing in the region, must in some way come to terms with the fact that Cuba kind of has to be at the table, or you lose moral?
So that's a great observation, Rob. That again, to the Zoom crowd, there's been, as John Kirk noted, a pinkish tide in Latin America, and the question is, why hasn't that impacted the Biden administration policy? And I think partly it's because the Biden administration doesn't care about Latin America. This was evident in the Summit of the Americas this past June, which was really quite a disaster. Several countries didn't show up, and they didn't really care. And it was an indicator of how little Latin America mattered, other than the issue of migration. So that's the one issue that they pay attention to. And in fact, there were a lot of Cubans trying to come to the United States, which in fact led the Biden administration to change the policy towards Cuban migration. But beyond that, they're not going to, I agree with Bill, they're not going to.
Marcy, please, and speak loud so the people in Zoom. Colo, can you check if they are hearing the questions on Zoom, or we should repeat them? The ones in person first, perfect. Marcy, please go ahead.
So similar along that lines, what I heard at some report that came out of Juan Gonzalez on the radio was like how U.S. policy towards Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba is propelling people to have to leave. So is it possible that the massive immigration towards this country would be a good political/economic motivation for Biden to rethink policies, despite, you know, the authoritarian issue?
You would think so. Yeah. But I'm afraid, well, so first, Biden did relax travel restrictions somewhat, and he did relax remittance restrictions somewhat, and allowed Western Union to reopen wire service remittances, all of which I think were motivated by this issue of migration primarily, although trying to sell the Latin Americans at the summit was another motivation there. But I think their main strategy on migration from Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua is the humanitarian parole programs that they've created, trying to channel people into legal paths to migration so that they're not showing up on the southern border. Because legal migration is not their political problem. Their political problem is the visuals, if you will, of all of these people showing up undocumented at the southern border. So I think they feel like they've got that piece of it under control, although they have action, because the numbers for Cubans arriving on the southern border are going up again.
Thank you, Denise.
Thank you. Denise Bravo, Policy Foundation, Boston. I'm working on the Cuban migration and remittances. So one of the things that I'm seeing is that after Western Union came back to operate in Cuba again, they haven't gained their clients again. And I am comparing Cubans in Miami and Madrid. And something that I find interesting is that because of, well, there are multiple causes, but one is the closure of Western Union. They have been increasing other kind of channels, like informal channels, digital channels. And something that I find interesting, I'm not sure if it's related to that policy of closing Western Union in Cuba, but something that I'm seeing is very interesting when you talk to Cubans, not only in Miami, but also in Madrid. It was surprising to me about sending remittances. When you're touching face to face, someone say, no, I don't send remittances. I just recharge their phone. Oh, well, when they say a birthday, send something. Or no, they visit home at home. Why you don't say openly, I send remittances? This is different from other migrants in the region, right? Like many migrants come or go to other countries and they proudly say, I help my family sustainability. They need because I'm helping them too. But the Cuban case is kind of different. And I was surprised because I expected that from Cubans in Miami, because there have been political narrative. They have been a campaign and Paragon, stop sending remittances to Cuba. And that didn't happen in Madrid. But still talking recently to people in Madrid, they are kind of hesitant to openly say, oh yes, I send remittances. And then he said, no, I'm sending medicines or something like that. So this is something that I find interesting. And the question I have is, just to get your everyone's perspective, is that knowing that there is an increasing migration, there is I would say, a new migratory wave since 2021 with the crossing of the borders, that the number surpasses both the two previous migratory waves together. And knowing that probably Cuban migrants accounts for around 20% of the whole Cuban population, taking into account that there are 11 million in Cuba and abroad there are more than 2 million. So what is the role of the Cuban? How do you see Cubans abroad participating in the changes or processes in Cuba, in the future of Cuba?
Oh, answer your question.
Yeah, I think in the introduction, I talk about kind of 5 big changes that happened in Cuban society in this period. And the first one is the impact of the expansion of internet and new technologies, and how that is impacting everyday life. And very much so, you know, the way that people on the island use WhatsApp to find out what store is selling chicken, right? Or, you know, the very basic everyday stuff, right? Or using WhatsApp to communicate with their children, elementary school kids, teachers during the really strict shutdowns during the pandemic. I do research now on birth and breastfeeding in Cuba and the ways in which women in early motherhood are using the internet and mobile technologies to create new infrastructures of care, to take care of themselves and each other during really vulnerable time in their lives, right, in this transition to motherhood. And this happened right at the time, the period I'm studying is the access in December 2018 to internet access on your cell phone, right? And the pandemic as well, and how important these social networks became for everyday life in Cuba, right? From the very basics of how to survive, right? And that does not change when people leave the island, right? People are still connected in these WhatsApp groups. They're still connected through social media with their peers on the island on an everyday, every hour kind of basis, right? If you look at, 10 years ago when somebody left Cuba, you left Cuba and you were gone, right? And it was so expensive pre-internet to make a phone call that you might call your mother on her birthday, right? And it would cost you, $3 a minute, right? To today, where people are in constant contact and communication, right? Which means that today, when Cubans leave Cuba, they're not there physically, but they're still there, right? And they're still part of the same social networks, the same communities and connections, right? So that's a huge shift. And it has a huge impact on the future of the island, right? Because we are not there, you and I, and are not there like many people of our generation, right? And many intellectuals of our generation, many people of all different areas of society, we're not there, but we're still there, right? And I'm seeing in my research on Cuban motherhood, the ways in which these new mothers who are now in Germany, who are in Miami, who are in, Homestead, right? Or they're in Houston, right? These new kind of receiving communities, the ways in which the fact that they're still able to communicate with their community, their culture, is having both a big impact on the way that they become mothers and they learn how to raise a Cuban child, whether it's in Houston or Norton or Madrid, but also what they see and the experiences that they have in all of those places is also impacting the life of Cuban mothers in Cuba, right? And the relationships that they have with the health system, what they expect of the state, right? So it's definitely a huge change that this new technology has made.
Let me just add a couple of things about remittances. So, I think you're absolutely right. The reason that Western Union is not getting its customers back is because people found informal channels to send remittances when it was not legal in the United States, and they continued to use those channels. Whether it'll migrate back, because a lot of those informal channels, as I'm sure you know, charge ridiculous commissions for goods. The other thing is that a lot of remittances now are going into the private sector as investment, in effect, rather than going to individual families for the purpose of consumption. So that may be part of what's going on too. There is a campaign in Miami to get people to not send remittances. It's not working. There's good polling data that shows that 40+% of people are sending remittances now, and that's consistent from historical numbers. And 46% and this is Cuban Americans in South Florida, they're not statewide. And 46% are opposed to any legal restrictions on remittances. Finally, this issue of, so I don't believe that there are 2 million immigrants in just the last couple of years.
Oh, no.
Oh, you mean,
It's
oh,
all- no,
yes, okay, yeah. No, because I was in a conversation this morning when someone said, well, just in the last few years, there's been 4 million migrants. And I said,
Oh,
"Oh,
no.
that's
That's a good
that's
set,
not
that's what-
possible, right? It's not possible. But the fact that last year was 400,000 and this year will probably be 200,000 is really extraordinary when you look at, the size of the population and what historical migration was.
Thank you. We have some questions from Zoom, so Coco's gonna read 4 or 5 of them, and then you take your pick of which ones to answer.
So Aileen Stewart said, "Thank you for interesting presentation."
Here's the mic.
Yeah, sure. So Aileen Stewart said, "Thanks for interesting presentations. Is Cuban leadership likely to consider new options to weather the current crisis? What might those be?"
Read a couple more so that,
I'll read some more.
please.
The next one is in regards to tourism. What percentage of the total number would be returning / visiting Cuba? Your best guesstimate. Are they still providing healthcare in Haiti, and are the training hospitals still open? Someone named Camila said, "Thanks to the great panelists for all their insightful research. Could you please comment on the impact of US sanctions and whether they are a significant factor in the decline in some of the social implicators such as social equality, women's participation in the labor force, etc.?"
Thank you. Okay, who wants to tackle which?
I mean, I'm happy to talk about whether Cuban leaders, have options. I think one of the great dilemmas that they face is that all the things that they really need to do to restart the economy, to undertake the kind of macroeconomic stabilization that's required, they need foreign exchange currency to do it. And they don't have it right now. And so they don't have the wherewithal to undertake some of the measures that they admit that they need to take. And then there's that political dilemma that I spoke of at the very end of my talk, where taking those measures will make life harder for people who are already suffering tremendously. Not taking them prolongs the current crisis in which people are suffering tremendously. And so their strategy right now is to undertake the measures, but to do it gradually. I think trying to mitigate the pain inflicted on the population on the one hand, but also in the hope that the foreign exchange earnings are going to gradually increase as tourism begins to recover post-pandemic and as remittances begin to flow again. But they just don't have a lot of options. What they really need to do is move ahead on the things they've already identified as things that they need to do. It's not that they don't understand what they need to do. It's that they feel this political constraint on actually moving forward to doing them, and then the lack of foreign exchange currency, which makes it even harder.
You want to answer any of the questions from my mind?
Do you want to speak to the healthcare?
Sure. In terms of the question about healthcare, are Cubans still in Haiti? Absolutely. Cuba has trained about 1,200 Haitians at no charge to the Haitian government in Santiago at a Francophone campus, and they have returned to Haiti. And in the earthquake in 2010 was the earthquake in Haiti. There were already approximately 300 Cuban doctors working in Haiti, and several hundred others also came from the island. In terms of the training school, I think that the questioner is referring to ELAN, La Escuela Latinoamericana de Medicina. ELAN was set up as a result of an initiative by Fidel Castro to take revenge on Hurricane Mitch and to train doctors to work specifically originally in Central America after the impact had devastated Honduras in particular and Guatemala to a certain extent. Since then, approximately 30,000 physicians have been trained at ELAN. I think there are about 350, maybe 400 Americans, visible minorities largely, who've been trained at no charge in Cuba at ELA. So to answer, yes, the Cubans are still very involved in training doctors for training Haitian doctors, still in the field, and also are still involved with ELAM in Havana.
So I understand the question about the U.S. policy and its impact. It's very easy to blame the United States for all of Cuba's ills. And I've long been suspicious of that as an excuse, but it's no longer just an excuse. There really is a serious impact. And you can see that from the change from the Obama period to the Trump period, when there was significant loss in tourist money, and it was also that the rightward swing in Latin America hurt Cubans. So, for example, the loss of sending doctors to Brazil. So Cuba sends doctors to very poor countries without any charge, and it sends doctors to countries that can afford to pay for it, a charge that then earns Cuba some hard currency. And Brazil was one of those countries. And then when Bolsonaro came in, as the leader of Brazil, he canceled essentially the Cuban program. That was true as well in Peru. It was true in, I guess, Ecuador. And so the loss of money of that sort was a casualty of U.S. policy, of the Trump policy. The problem is that the Biden policy really hasn't been different than the Trump policy. The Biden policy is still to squeeze Cuba very hard, for many of the reasons that Professor LeoGrande suggested. And it has an impact on everyday life because it matters in terms of what Cubans can obtain. So let's take the case of COVID. Cuba developed a very effective vaccine, but it couldn't administer that vaccine to its own people because it didn't have syringes. And it couldn't afford to buy syringes. Syringes ultimately were provided by a number of aid agencies, but initially they couldn't provide the vaccine to their own people because they didn't have syringes. It's that kind of impact on daily life that makes the U.S. embargo actually a human rights violation.
Just a real quick answer to the question, do we know what percentage of tourists are return visitors? The answer is no, we don't. There's no public data on that I'm aware of. It could be, if I had to guess, since the questioner asked us to guess, I would guess that it's lower than the Caribbean average, because, in particular, this is particularly true in recent years, the quality of service has deteriorated somewhat, even at the best hotels, and that's a consequence of the pervasive shortages on the island. And so someone who comes expecting the traditional Caribbean 3-star, 4-star hotel experience is probably not going to get it in Cuba, and therefore may not come back. But I would say that's speculative on my part, because the data is just not up.
And you don't stay at it.
That would be illegal because they're on the beach.
It's not illegal for Canadians. And I have taken one for the team and occasionally have gone to the beach. Research. Last year, for this year, 600,000 Canadians have gone to Cuba. That's probably about half of what the normal number. Of the people who are repitentes, who go back, it's estimated for Canadians for about 40%. And I think that's because of our long, cold winter that you repeat very happily, and the prices are very economical. So I think that the point that you raised, though, is very important, Phil. Given the economic challenges facing Cuba and the difficulties and the crisis that Cuba is in at the moment, how can you get the food, the quality of the food, to give to the tourists when people are leaving from their jobs in the resorts? How do you get people trained to fill the gap? So I think that approximately we're about 50% back to where we were in pre-COVID times. But I think that there's a big question, a lot of uncertainty and some concern.
Wanted to add something about the question about sanctions. Thinking about tourism as, you know, post-COVID, kind of looking at what were the real motors of the economy in terms of their contributions of hard currency, right? So we have the medical internationalism in the countries that can pay. And that was, you know, that's not an option anymore because of the political changes in the region. And then you have tourism, and you have remittances, right? So remittances, the Trump policy severely limited that for quite a long time in the middle of the worst period of the pandemic. And then you have tourism, right? And nobody's traveling anywhere because of COVID, right? It's not even just Cuba. But of those three kind of big pieces, what's the hope of what can come back, right? What can start bringing hard currency back in, right? And tourism, as people begin to travel, is one of those potential sources of hard currency. And then the U.S. policy with restricting the ability of people, the ESTA, right? So for countries that don't have to get a visa to come to the United States, they have this visa waiver program. And then just basically like the same month as like when the high season was beginning in Cuba, which would be kind of the first time when tourists would come back, right? The U.S. made that change to the visa restriction, so that if you go to Cuba, you can't go to the United States, right? And for people especially from Europe, from the UK, that was a huge, you know, if you're just going somewhere because it's warm and there's a beach, you know, you don't choose Cuba anymore, right? And so that was kind of this. Yeah. So that was this, you know, oh, tourism is coming back. The big season is coming. It's going to save us all. And then that policy.
So in most of the Caribbean, tourism is back to 89% of what it was before the pandemic. In Cuba, it's 57%. And really only in the Canadians are the only major group that's at 57%, or thereabouts, 59, something like that. The Europeans are only 40%, and it's precisely because of this wave. And the US numbers are way down because of the travel.
Bastian.
Quick question. So it seems to me there was a period where universities and colleges had like semesters abroad in Cuba, and you used to have it. I feel like that was positive in a number of ways, including sparking interest by young people in learning about Cuba and connecting with people and all that. So did that diminish because of Trump's policy or economic stuff or something else? Because it seems to me like we lost something valuable by those programs. It seems to me that they're not around anymore. I don't know for you.
Yeah, because of Trump policy.
Yeah.
And COVID, well, a combination. I mean, Trump made it very hard because of the way they changed the regulations, and then COVID just stopped everything.
Education programs were still permitted, so I just wonder why they all disappeared.
So they went back to some of the limits that Bush had put on academic programs, which made it harder, to manage.
One of the problems is where students are housed. And so there are now significant limitations on where you can spend money to house students. And anything connected to removing the military prevents illegal expenditure.
We'll have two last questions before we open it for reception. It's going to happen in the back. And then I encourage you to buy your books so you can come get them signed by the editors, and you can come and ask more questions so have conversation one-on-one. So we have one question from the audience and then one online. We'll ask them together and then we'll split there.
My question goes beyond the political things. It's mostly about the local capacity for food production. I'm an agronomist. I went a couple of years ago. I went there. It surprises me that I see empty areas and no livestock. I can understand that there might be some reasons, but well, let's speak about what is the current capacity of the food production at this particular time? And why is it that there is not local, at least that might be information? I might be wrong. What I saw was that the empty fields, and probably was not the time to plant or anything like that. But the question continues to be, when the stomach hurts, people's mood. So obviously there is food or not food, or what's the current situation there for food production?
A great question. Please, Coco. One on that. Yes.
The question online, the last one, is from Deborah James. They ask, can panelists comment on how fair the Cuban Doctors Abroad program is for Cuban doctors themselves? As I understand it, Cuban doctors abroad receive a fraction of what the countries pay the Cuban government, and they may not be able to see their families in Cuba for a year or two. Does the Cuban government get the bulk of the payment? Has it changed in recent years? And what are your comments on the fairness of this for the doctors?
Thank you, Coco. And I also want to thank Encarnacione, Coco, and Diana, First Garay, and Sophia, and Belen for helping Erica, for helping putting this event together. Who wants to answer those questions?
Let me deal with the medical internationalism one. I studied, I interviewed 270 internationalistas. I was embedded with the Henry Reed Brigade in El Salvador after a hurricane. I went to several Operación Milagro eye clinics in Guatemala, interviewed people throughout the island. And I've never met a Cuban doctor or nurse or technician who told me that they went because they wanted to, because they were forced to. I've never met a Cuban internationalista in the medical field who said they went because they were doing it to help their country. They went because they were getting several times more the salary that they would have received if they stayed in Cuba. So the first reason for people to volunteer to go abroad or to participate is extra money. You can fix up the kitchen, you can get a new car, you can go to Varadero, a variety of reasons. I think that the Cuban doctors, in general, this is the main source of hard currency. Probably, I guesstimate about $4 billion last year from Medical International, starting to edge up. And with the new government in Brazil, may increase more. Mexico, Italy also are growth markets. The Cuban doctors get paid between 20 and 30% of whatever the host country pays. But it's interesting that 20 to 30% again is many times more. I've interviewed doctors who've been in Qatar and they received 10 times the salary that they would have received. I've interviewed doctors who worked in Brazil and they received 6 times what they would have received. Go for 11 months, come back for a month's vacation, and then go back for a year. Live in very perilous conditions, very difficult conditions. They live in conditions where the local doctors, mainly urban educated middle-class doctors, mainly white, will not go. So they provide a medical service that in many cases was not available before. Are they exploited? Most of I don't think so. I think that the 55 countries that currently employ them don't think they are. I don't think PAHO thinks that they are. Don't think that most medical associations don't think that either. Apart from the gremios or the associations of doctors in the individual countries who want to protect the rights and the privileges of their own members. So to answer the question, I don't think it's slavery as the Brazil situation. When Bolsonaro came in, they were called escravos. I think it's good. It's win-win. I think it's good for the doctors, and I think it's good for the patients more than anybody, who in many cases getting medical care for the first time in their lives. And it's also good for the Cuban government because it brings in hard currency, most of which goes to the healthcare system.
The question about food production.
Yeah, I'll say a few words about that, but first I want to address this issue. And let me just pose a question to you. Do you think when PricewaterhouseCoopers sends economic consultants abroad to provide advice to a foreign government, that those consultants get 100% of what that country pays to PricewaterhouseCoopers?
No.
No, of course. on food, there's a couple of reasons. First, it's important to know that Cuba has never been self-sufficient in the production of food. And the reason for that is because they produce sugar. And they exported sugar, and that was the core of their economy, and for many, many, many years. In 2003, they closed down about half of the sugar mills because they were so old in terms of their technology that they were actually losing money. And most of that land is still lying fallow. They have created a usufruct program to try to get the existing private farmers to take on some of that land, and some of them have. But Cuba is not an agricultural country. It's a 70% urban country. And there aren't particularly lots of people who want to go out and struggle in the countryside becoming farmers. On top of that, you have the regulatory regime that the government imposes on farmers, which doesn't create, and I'm going to put this in a polite way, doesn't create a lot of incentives for farmers to increase production. And so you combine those two things together, and you've got a situation in which food security is perpetual. And then you add onto that now the lack of foreign exchange currency, so that they can't import machinery, they can't import fuel for transporting food to market, they can't import seed and fertilizer. And I think you put all those things together and you understand why agricultural production is not only historically lagged, but in the last few years has really plummeted and aggravated the food crisis even more than they normally have.
Unfortunately, we have come out of time, but congratulations again to the editors. Thank you for coming again.
Thank you.